Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Andrew Johnson, and the focus is conflict with Congress intensifies. The year is 1866, and Johnson indeed has conflict with Congress over what to do with the South, Reconstruction, how to bring those southern states back into the Union in the wake of the Civil War. And he had conflict there, but he also had conflict closer to home in his own cabinet. Now, he had inherited this cabinet from Abraham Lincoln. He was deciding that, look, several of these members were frankly too close to the radical Republicans, the leading parts of the House and Senate who were his political enemies at the time, and he wanted several of them out. He did evict several, but one of those who had been aligned behind the scenes with the radicals was allowed to stay. That was Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. This was a move that Johnson would later regret. We'll cover that in a future episode. Well, Johnson also started handing out jobs, bringing in friends into not only the cabinet, but other positions in the federal government, using the power of patronage offered to presidents to fill the federal positions. He was giving out jobs to many Democrats, in fact. Anybody who he thought was going to be more aligned to his political points of view. But the big move that Johnson was going to make is he was going to take his message directly to the American people. This is where Johnson felt he was often at his best, on the stump, making the case directly to the people, the masses. Sometimes he would get caught up in the emotion, which is why his supporters were always nervous when Johnson was going to go on these big trips and campaign-like events, because sometimes he would overreach. He'd get emotional, perhaps say the wrong thing. Johnson was convinced, though, the right move, take the message to the people. So he launched what he called the swing around the circle. 10 states over 19 days, and what he was really trying to do was encourage the electorate to oppose the policies of the radical Republicans and send new people to Congress, to take away these veto-proof majorities that existed in both the House and the Senate, change that dynamic, and he was trying to influence that with this tour, or the swing around the circle. He brought an all-star cast with him, members of the cabinet, war heroes like General Ulysses Grant and Admiral David Farragut. He had his family in the form of his daughter, Martha, give him some companionship on this trip. It was a big event, and it started out really, really well. Large crowds, supportive crowds in Philadelphia and Baltimore and throughout the state of New Jersey and the state of New York, where there had been many stops and many speeches, most of which were very well supportive, as Johnson made his case directly to the people on what to do with the South. In New York, on August 1866, Johnson said, "They are our brethren. They are part of ourselves. They are bone of our bone and flesh of our flesh. We have come together again. And now, after having understood what the feud was, the great apple of discord removed, having lived under the Constitution of the United States in the past, they asked to live under it in the future. This government cannot get along without the South. I fought those in the South who commenced the rebellion, and now I oppose those in the North who are trying to break up the Union. I am for the Union. I am against all those who are opposed to the Union. I am for the Union, the whole Union, and nothing but the Union. And for this, the South needed seats back in Congress." Of course, the radicals who were running Congress were simply saying no. Johnson's support began to wane as the trip shifted into the Midwest, to Ohio and Michigan and Illinois, because the radicals changed their tactics. They decided to heckle the president, to try to get under his skin, to bait him into arguing with them, and that is exactly what he did. He took the bait, and his rhetoric started to fire up a little bit. In Ohio, he said of the radicals, have they done anything to restore the union of these states? No. On the contrary, they have done everything to prevent it. And because I stand now where I did when the rebellion commenced, I have been denounced as a traitor. I tell you, my countrymen, though the powers of hell, death, and Stevens combined, there is no power that can control me save you and the God that spoke me into existence. Stevens, of course, being Thaddeus Stevens, the leader of the radical Republicans in the House of Representatives and Johnson's political rival. This is what Johnson was getting into, that heat of the moment, and it was starting to backfire, because as he was increasingly argumentative, his increasing defiance, the public started to turn against him. And these events, like the one coming up in St. Louis, they were actually starting to get very heated, in fact, even physically heated, as Johnson continued to make the case. this time around a word that had started to surface: impeachment. For the first time, that had entered into the discourse, and Johnson was again defiant. Oh yes, this Congress that could make a war upon the executive because he stands for the Constitution and vindicates the rights of the people, exercising the veto power in their behalf because he dared to do this. They clamor and talk about impeachment, he said indignantly. Well, that's exactly what he did. And there was a mini riot that broke out in St. Louis over this kind of discourse. And none of this, regardless of the potential merits of his argument, none of this was looking good upon the President of the United States. Having shouting matches with the public, with the masses, it was very unbecoming, did not play well with a lot of the people who were there, did not play well in the press, did not play well with a pretty important person who was at his side at the time, General Ulysses Grant, who would play a pretty important role in the balance of Johnson's term. He wrote home at the time that I have never been so tired of anything before as I have been with the political stump speeches of Mr. Johnson. I look upon them as a national disgrace. The divide between Johnson and Grant, which would go very large in the future, was really starting to separate. Well, there was one member of the Radical Republicans, at least one of the founding members of the Radical Republicans, who did offer support to Johnson. And that was Secretary of State William Seward, who had been on the groundswell of the Republican Party from the very beginning back in the middle of the 1850s. But he had grown very close to Abraham Lincoln and when he was serving as Lincoln's Secretary of State. And now he was offering his support for Johnson, who he believed, like others, that Johnson was simply trying to follow Lincoln's vision. Seward said toward the end of the swing around the circle, "My mind is clear, and I wish to say that your course is right, and that I have felt it my duty to sustain you in it. And if my life is spared, I shall continue to do so. Pursue it for the sake of the country. It is correct. There were few intimates of Lincoln's who were trying to urge Johnson to stay the course, but mostly this was falling on deaf ears, just voices in the breeze, because the radical Republican message was much more resonating with the electorate, and it showed in the fall elections. Not only did they not decrease their veto-proof majorities as Johnson had hoped, they increased them. In both the House and the Senate, completely locked down. Johnson was going to have virtually no say as the president, even with his veto power, in terms of legislation for the balance of his term. Well, the latest clash over legislation was over the military Reconstruction Bill that was enacted over Johnson's veto January 1867. Congress did was they took the 10 seceded states, not Tennessee, which was one of the original 11, because Tennessee, Johnson's home state, had actually been brought back fully into the Union by Congress, but the other 10 were still on the outside looking in. Congress created 5 military districts, 2 states per district, and they sent 20,000 troops to enforce the edicts of the commanders, who were given essentially total control to try to implement the will of the federal government, regardless of what was happening in the individual states. Now, Johnson and his cabinet felt this was completely unconstitutional because it effectively tried to remove the president from the military chain of command. He was the commander-in-chief, but now these district commanders were given authority and essentially didn't have to listen to the president. They were in charge of their districts, and this unconstitutional overreach is what Johnson and the cabinet felt, and they went public in saying so. Well, that just got under the skin of the radicals like Thaddeus Stevens, who said Congress is the sovereign power. And though the president is commander-in-chief, Congress is his commander, and God willing, he shall obey. Conflict continued to intensify. Well, the next law made things perhaps even worse. The Tenure of Office Act also passed 1867 over the veto of Andrew Johnson. What did this do? Well, it required Senate approval before a president could remove a confirmed appointee. Advice and consent had always been required to place many of these positions, candidates into positions in the federal government from the United States Senate. That's in the Constitution. But the Constitution's silent about removing appointees. And ever since George Washington's days, every president had basically removed these folks at will. The very first Congress had tried to pass a similar law. It did not get to the president's desk. It actually died in the United States Senate. And ever since then, presidents had had clearly the authority to dismiss anyone they wanted for any reason. Congress said no, and they've made this violations of this act pretty painful. In the statute, $10,000 fine, imprisonment, and these 2 words, high misdemeanor. They called a violation of the Tenure of Office Act a high misdemeanor. Why did that matter? Well, the impeachment clause in the Constitution. There were 4 things that were justified of impeachment: bribery, treason, high crimes, and high misdemeanors. And some of those last couple of terms were actually pretty vague. They wanted to make sure there was nothing ambiguous about this law. If the president violated it, he would be committing a high misdemeanor. That was a direct shot to be able to impeach the president. Well, some members of Congress didn't want to wait for that. They were ready to impeach the president right now. And the leader of that movement was James Ashley of Ohio, who took to the floor of the House, declared impeaching the president, and actually launched an investigation into the president's actions to try to find something that would actually justify impeachment, because the initial charges were all incredibly vague. Well, they started investigating the president. How did they do it? Secret hearings. Testimony behind closed doors. They had about 100 witnesses. Most of them had a personal grudge or some kind of professional grudge with the president. They were trying to compile anything that would stick that they thought could actually rise to the level of a high crime or a high misdemeanor to be able to impeach the president. Well, there were no tax returns at the time, but the president certainly had finances, and Congress wanted access to those finances to see if maybe there was a scandal there. And so they subpoenaed those records, and what did Johnson do? Well, he pushed back. He said, look, I have had a son killed. A son-in-law died during the last battle at Nashville. Another son has thrown himself away. A second son-in-law is in no better condition. I think I have had sorrow enough without having my bank account examined by a committee of Congress. Nevertheless, he relented. They had access to his records, and what did they find? Well, all his investments were investments in U.S. securities. So there was certainly no scandal here. It was just embarrassing for the president, and another part of this intensified conflict that was very unbecoming as far as Johnson was concerned, this battle between the legislative branch and the executive branch. Well, the fact is the radicals appear to have overreached. They didn't find anything in his financial records. Of all this testimony behind closed doors, they didn't really get to anything that rose to the level of an impeachable offense that they could stand behind. So even with those supermajorities in Congress, the vote took place in the Judiciary Committee in June of 1867. It went 5-4. 5-4 against bringing impeachment charges to the full House. So never got to the full House, at least in this round, and Congress adjourned. Impeachment for now was off the table. There was one bright spot throughout all of this during Johnson's presidency. Even at this time, though, he was ridiculed for it. In the end, it would actually be a boon to the United States. And that's when the United States acquired Alaska. Secretary Seward had led the negotiations with Russia to acquire the 375 million acres for this check of $7 million. But he was actually mocked as Seward's folly. What do we want this land way up there, far away from sort of the continental United States? What do we want that as part of the United States for? Well, it turned out to be a phenomenal deal, obviously, even if you just look at the financials of it, with the large deposits of gold and oil that were discovered in Alaska for $7 million. This was a real estate boon for the country, many other reasons as well. At the time, though, it was ridiculed, and besides, it was still a sideshow. Andrew Johnson's presidency was all about conflict, and there was lots more of that ahead when Congress came back to session, but that is the story for another day. That is Andrew Johnson, and Conflict with Congress Intensified, from the life of Andrew Johnson. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com. Don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.